Welcome to my beginner's guide to N-scale railroading. Today we are looking at everything you need to know to get started in a DC ecosystem. Alrighty, before I get started about talking about these two sets that I've got behind me, there are a couple of things I'd like to go over ahead of time. There are a few different types of people that are looking at getting into DC railroading. And the first one, and probably the easiest one to tell what to do, is the guys coming back into the hobby that already have some vintage gear, maybe want some new track, a new locomotive, or maybe a new controller. In which case, basically you're looking at buying used equipment at that point. The DC controllers are really cheap on the used market. A lot of them have never been used. They just buy starter sets and then resell them. You may be interested in buying a starter set, and we'll get to that a little bit later. As for track, for the most part, I would recommend going with Cato Unitrack. If you have watched my DCC intro, you're going to know that there are some different options with different types of track. And if you are already invested in, a good amount of rolling stock and locomotives, unless you are considering putting together a complicated layout, in which case you may consider going to DCC at that point anyway, Unitrack is probably where you're going to want to start out. And if you need a controller or, would just like to have an extra and some track, the Cato M1 and Cato M2 are really good options. The M1 is basically a loop of track with the DC controller, and the M2 is a larger loop of track with a siding and, a little bit of extras here and there. So really good price points on those, $100 to $150. It's a really good place to start if you are coming back into this and you already own some equipment. As for locomotives, obviously the used market for DC is pretty well put together. Cato, some Atlases, and Intermountain have some really good DC locomotives that you could probably get into affordably. But honestly, for ease, Cato's probably the place to start. Now there's also another type of person, and instead of looking at the two kits we got here, you're probably not considering doing a loop of track and running continuous trains. You're possibly considering putting together a little switching layout. It might have a run around, or it might just have multiple locations that you're looking to move cars with one or two locomotives. For a shelf type layout that you do switching on, a starter set's probably not where you're going to want to start. There are Cato track sets that have lots of turnouts. But in that particular situation, if you're looking for something that is challenging and you want some interesting track design and industry type turnouts, you might be looking at getting into Atlas or Pico turnouts, traditional rail, and flex track to kind of put together some interesting ways to shuffle cars around. So you're a little bit different situation than just the normal starter guy. Also, because of the way starter sets come, you're basically stuck with F units and road diesels. Switching units don't generally come in the starter sets, so you're probably looking at buying used models at that point or new DC models. There's not a whole lot of DC switchers out there currently available. There are more GPs coming to the market in the next few months, but for the most part, you're looking at probably getting used equipment. Nothing wrong with that. Most of those diesels are relatively reliable, as well as some of the steamers that run in DC, should you want to be doing some switching with those. So for those guys, absolutely go get yourself a DC controller. They're $20, $30, new, used, whatever, on eBay, and put together a really cool track plan on any Rail 6 and lay down some traditional track. Not that you can't do it with Unitrack or Bachmann track. It just is a whole lot easier to put together complicated turnarounds and switchbacks, or a little bit of a run around to get your diesels through to switch some cars in some different directions when you have the flexibility of flex track and a whole plethora of different turnouts. So now let's get into the meat and potatoes, where most everybody's coming from. and start looking into the DC starter sets. So honestly, the majority of the people coming to this particular video, they are just getting started in railroading. They want something easy to put together, something reliable, and honestly, price is going to be a big consideration. And there's a pretty big price point difference in the two starter sets that I have in front of you, and we're going to go over the differences, but I want to have a little bit of a rant on getting started in the DC ecosystem. So if you are that type of person, like I just said, you just kind of want to have something easy and good to go, a lot of people really turn to the Bachmann starter sets. They're considered a beginner brand, and honestly, they're very reliable. They're all pretty darn good, but there are some things that you need to be aware of before you invest in an ecosystem. When looking at any vintage starter set, a lot of times you are going to run into diesels and cars, possibly even steamers, depending on where you're trying to get started. They generally come with a different type of coupler than is currently the norm in the N-scale market. Older units come with Rapido couplers, and they just look like a big latching system. And we'll get to them in a future video, all of the different couplers that you can get on rolling stock. But also, the thing you need to be aware of is all modern diesels and steam locomotives have body mount couplers. A lot of the vintage diesels and steam engines have truck mounted couplers, or in the case of the steam engines, like the actual tender trucks have the couplers attached to them. They tend to track the rails really well. They tend to couple around corners really good, but they have their disadvantages, like backing through turnouts and stuff like that. But the Rapido couplers are bulky and do not mesh at all with the more modern, like these two, pieces of rolling stock or engines. So that's something to be aware of. They also look a little less scale. The more modern DC systems, the engines from the last 10 years, are just drastically more detailed, as well as the rolling stock. So unless you're super tight on budget, I would probably recommend looking at, relatively new DC starter sets. They can be used like this set here, or brand new like the Cato set that I've got here. So how do you put together a budget for what you want to do? Well, Bachmann is always going to be drastically cheaper than the Cato counterpart. But there are some things to consider. What kind of engine do you want? What kind of rolling stock do you want? Because, like you see here, there's two totally different types of starter systems. This one's a passenger, and this one is a freight system. Or maybe do you want a steam engine type one? Honestly, when it comes to steam engines, Bachmann makes really good starter sets. Be aware that especially the newer ones, have the same type of coupler system that these have, and we'll get to looking at those in a minute. But if you're into the diesels and you're fine with that, you have to consider, do you want to do freight, or do you want to do passenger service, or do you kind of want to do a combination of both at some point? Also, finding an engine that you might like in a starter set can be difficult. F units, like these F3s or F7s, are generally pretty common. Everybody kind of likes these, so they have been in starter sets forever. There are some GP units, like GP60s, that type of thing, that would come in the Bachmann sets. And in the Cato sets, they have freight units that have ES44 ACs, 6-axle road units. They're very reliable, excellent pullers, easy to convert to DCC should you ever want to. And the only problem with those starter sets is they come with rolling stock that isn't really for the North American market. They're kind of repainted Japanese rolling stock, and so as you progress in your hobby, they can look a little bit funny. They absolutely function flawlessly, but it's something to be aware of as you're kind of putting together your roster of rolling stock. They might not fit with everybody. So really, for starter sets, Cato has better passenger service type things, and Bachmann, at least for the time being, has really good steam stuff as well as some pretty decent freight locomotive options. That being said, I would probably recommend everyone stay away from the Bachmann stuff if possible. Not because it's bad, but because it really limits how you grow in the hobby. If you go back and maybe you watched my DCC intro, but being in the Bachmann track ecosystem really limits your capabilities. Now, if you're not looking to get into any sort of complex track work, this might be excellent. But if you want to do switching at all, where you're connecting and disconnecting rolling stock from the engine, you're going to probably struggle with this. Cato, on the other hand, all of their locomotives in all of their recent runs of everything from, I want to say, the mid-90s up until now, all of them are easily convertible to DCC should you want to. And honestly, their passenger rolling stock really is kind of the industry standard for good, affordable passenger rolling stock. You will find that freight cars are expensive, but passenger rolling stock is very expensive. So a lot of people really gravitate to the Cato because they're kind of the happy medium. They're not chintzy looking, they're not super high end, they're durable, they run well, and they're usually pretty affordable. Not to mention they also come with Cato couplers, which again are not the best for switching, but they're more functional than the Bachmann ones. So let's go ahead and dig into these two starter sets and see what you get for your money. So like I said, I picked up this particular unit used. I found a good deal on it on eBay. It came with everything. I'm pretty established in the hobby, so if it was a dud, it wasn't going to be the end of the world. Something like this new is about $100 on Amazon or eBay, and realistically I only saved like $20 buying this used, but I do what I got to do to keep my videos running. This is kind of an expensive thing to do, but let's go ahead and open this up and see what all comes in it. Okay, so be really aware when you open these things up that there are components on both sides of the styrofoam, so you don't want to lose anything. But just like all DC starter sets, you're going to get your controller. This is a Bachmann controller. It is very simple. It has a DC input and a track output, some cooling vents on the bottom, a directional switch, and a rotating potentiometer to control the speed of the engine. They are robust, very well put together. They have a nice smooth rotational feel to them. They're good potentiometers, and I mean they're built to last. Honestly, there's not a whole lot in these. The real wear component is the little power brick that you get in here, and honestly they pretty well last forever. For anybody who doesn't know, the Bachmann, focus for me, the Bachmann connector is basically just a 3.5mm audio plug that plugs into this, and a flat connector that plugs into the track. This is reversible either direction, so when you set up your rail, should you not like the forward and reverse direction on here, you want it to match the locomotive, you can flip the polarity on this and you're rocking and rolling. The engine will be running the other direction. Now inside this kit, you have 4 pieces of rolling stock. This one is not what actually came with the kit. They substituted this in from another one. Again, not a big deal. I bought this used, so just saving some money where I can. But one thing about most Bachmann rolling stock is you have metal wheel sets. And you'll see the knuckle couplers there. Don't know that my camera can focus that close. But they don't have any articulation point. They are solid knuckle couplers. So when they come together, a good knuckle coupler from a reputable brand, Accumate, Microtrains, Athearn options, when they come to couple together, the knuckle can kind of move out of the way to make it easier to couple to other pieces of rolling stock. These don't do that. It actually requires a pretty good amount of force to push them together and connect. But really, most of the time what you're doing is just kind of setting them on top of one another so the couplers align with one another. And honestly, when you look at the Bachmann rolling stock, some of the features are a little bit exaggerated, but what that does mean is you get a little bit of detail at, a little bit of distance when you're looking at the engine. So a lot of high-end rolling stock, you have to be right up next to it to kind of see what's going on. And for someone like me, that is more where I'm at in my hobby. Other people might find that the reliability of these, I don't know if you'd call them chintzier, but less detailed models, you can't really harm them, and at a little bit of distance, you can kind of see what's going on. And then we'll just pull this out quickly because we're going to take a closer look with this unit. The reason why I picked the Bachmann set with the F unit is because we're going to compare it to the Cato F unit on track. So we'll get a closer look at this in a second. On the back side, of course, you get your instructions. Nobody cares about that. And Bachmann sets generally come with just enough track to make a circle. And I want to say it's like a 9 3/4 inch circle. So that's like an 18-inch, diameter circle, all said and done. There are a few of the more modern sets that come with some straight pieces that will give you an actual oval. So keep that in mind. A lot of the Bachmann sets only come with a circle of track. Okay, so next up we are looking at the Cato starter set here. And this is the Santa Fe Super Chief. And it's got an F unit in it. And honestly, if you're going to have any sort of F unit on your layout, you almost got to have a Santa Fe. These things are iconic. And new, old, doesn't matter. You can slap this on a layout and nobody's going to ask any questions like, oh, aren't you running a modern layout? Yeah, man, I just like F units. Leave me alone. Everybody accepts them as awesome. So they're basically the standard when it comes to just awesome little locomotives to run. Doesn't matter if you're trying to model a specific era or not. Nobody's going to care if you're running an F unit. So the Cato set is drastically more expensive than a Bachmann starter set. A lot of the Bachmann starter sets for diesel locomotives, like I said, are about $100 to $150. The steamer sets can get up in there to the $200, $250, but a lot of times they're a little more complex and steam engines can be a little more difficult to keep running than a diesel. So especially for the real beginner, the diesels are probably where you're going to want to start. But inside the foam, again, double-sided, so be careful not to lose the stuff on the back. You have 12-inch radius curves down here, and then quite a bit of straight track. This will take up an entire dining room table pretty easily, and that's a little more fun for dad or son or whatever, daughter in that case. Having some straights really adds a little bit more fun to the situation. So if you can, make sure you try to get an oval versus a circle. It just makes it more fun. The big thing that is different between the Bachmann and the Cato is the actual DC controller. This has a lot of perks over the Bachmann one. Same idea, wall wart power supply, and then a little bit different connector here to plug into track power, but the idea is exactly the same. The wire that comes with this simply plugs in. I believe that is considered, focus, a JST connector, and that just slots into your track power. Little short piece of track here. It is not reversible. It only goes in one direction and only plugs into this one direction. So not as cool like if you have a specific layout and you want your engines to run in the same direction that you flip the forward reverse on here. Unfortunately, it's not something you can do easily on the Cato system. There are options out there that make it a capability, but honestly, it's probably not worth your time. The other thing is you have these side mount buttons right here that power your accessory switches. So if you want to run electronic turnouts, all Cato turnouts come with these little switch machine things when you buy them as sets. And when they plug into this, they have power, so you can power them individually. Otherwise, you have to have a separate power source to run those switches. Power brick, pretty standard, just like we said. The other thing about this that is different than the Bachmann is there is a stop position on the actual controller. What that means, especially for kids, is the tendency is to take the throttle and spin it up and down all the way, full throttle, and then flipping between forward and reverse. And full throttle, forward to reverse, or reverse to forward can be really hard on engines. Not as hard on N-scale stuff because there's not as much rotating mass as compared to an HO, but it's still hard on things. It can still ruin components. So having that little click in between forward and reverse can give the engine a little bit of time to slow down and stop before it's flipped over. Also, hot tip, these are like 12 to 13.5 volt power supplies. If you are putting one of these systems together and you are trying to get a young kid to enjoy the trains with you and you want to let them have control of this, there are universal DC power supplies that you can buy on Amazon that have 3, 5, 9, and 12 volt switch options, as well as interchangeable ends, so you can just plug right into this. Those are excellent options for people looking to, one, enjoy the entire capability of a full power supply. So you're an adult, you want to be able to run the train at full speed. Cool. That power supply you can then switch down to, say, 6 volts. So full throttle is essentially probably about half. It's not actually going to be half, but roughly half speed for a kid, So the full throttle throw is there, but they can't overspeed the engine. So you might consider that. They're about $20, and it's a cheap little insurance policy for the roughly $200 to $250 Cato starter set. Also can work with the Bachmann ones. Other added value is, if you're into it, jewel cases for your locomotives. Now, one thing about Cato is, like Bachmann, they have metal wheel sets, focus, and pickups in their passenger rolling stock. This means you can add light kits to these should you want to. It's kind of a pricey upgrade, but it really adds a nice effect. I personally haven't done it because I have a lot of rolling stock, and don't know if I totally want to do the lighting sets. But like I said, relatively decent quality rolling stock for a good price point. Good detail, there's windows in there, lots of little greeble details. And to be quite honest with you, I have tested a lot of Cato passenger rolling stock in the last couple of years, and other than sometimes being backed through turnouts, they're perfectly reliable in all forward operations, and they will go through just about any turnout you have. So really quality, affordable rolling stock to get started with. And also, all of their passenger stuff is accurate to North America. So let's go ahead now and dig out the F unit here, and let's compare them side by side on the track. And we want to talk a little bit about dealing with DC stuff when you start talking multiple engines. Alright, so we are looking at the Bachmann F7, and honestly, not a whole lot of difference between this and the Cato. The only thing is there's a couple of minor body details, but sitting next to one another, other than, say, the dual headlight on the Cato unit, they pretty much pass muster and would be acceptable on any layout next to one another. The one thing you should notice when looking at the Cato in particular is the nice short coupler length and more scale-sized coupler. That's something, as you grow and progress in the hobby, you are going to find to be desirable. And to be quite honest, in most cases, it works pretty well with the body mount couplers that come with other Cato pieces of rolling stock. There's not a whole lot of situations other than really tight radiuses where they don't function properly. A lot of times people want to put longer couplers on their units to make them a little more reliable. Honestly, other than in some odd circumstances with some more interesting turnouts, I haven't had to have longer couplers on my F units as compared to some of like my ES44 ACs, for example. Here is a better view of the coupler on the Bachmann F unit. Like I said, the coupler knuckle itself does not articulate, so this makes it difficult to get it to couple with other units. So as you can see there, you can't necessarily get the Cato to couple up to it. However, here are two Cato F units, and just like that, they're coupled up to one another. So generally, good couplers, when they come into contact with one another, they move just a little bit and clip and connect to one another. The Bachmann couplers just don't work that way. So if you're looking at switching, it's something to be very cognizant of, because it's probably going to ruin your experience. Okay, so the other thing that you need to be aware of is that these are DC units, and just because they're DC doesn't mean they're going to run with one another really well. This is kind of where DCC becomes a big part of the hobby. Now, this may or may not be a big deal for you, but for example, I have the two F units up top. One is Cato, one's Bachmann, and down below I have two Cato F units that I bought as a matched set. Now I'm going to turn on my DC controller, and I am going to slowly bring it up to speed and watch what happens with all of the different engines. So hopefully that kind of puts it into perspective. Despite the engines being all the same, a couple of them coming from exactly the same run and being a match set, they don't all run the same speed. So honestly, if you were looking to do multiple engine consists, you're probably going to want to consider doing DCC. Now, this isn't a big deal on, say, the Cato engine. It's easily DCC convertible. However, the Bachmann unit, there's no just drop-in easy option that you can do to convert it to DCC. Now, it still can be converted to DCC, but you're probably going to need soldering skills, and you're probably going to have to do quite a bit of measuring to get a board that's going to fit in there properly. Also, getting the lights to function where the LED hits the light pipes just perfectly is going to be difficult to do. The Cato units are designed to have DCC boards dropped into them, so all of that stuff functions really easily. The cost to convert them going to probably be about the same, other than the amount of time it's going to take for you to physically get it done. Also, DCCs, control boards that have back EMF, tend to function pretty flawlessly with Cato units, and speed matching them is pretty simple in the long run. But in all honesty, it is something you really need to consider when you're getting into the DC side of things. If you're wanting to do multiple engine consists, it's going to be a little bit more difficult to do on strictly DC. Now, not saying it's impossible. You will generally find that most engines don't start up or slow down at the same rate. They have slightly different start voltages, but there's a couple of points in the voltage curves where they kind of end up meshing with one another and they run at a consistent speed. You can usually kind of find that and then run them at those speeds. However, for doing switching work or wanting to stop and start quite a bit, like you have a little bit of a layout where you want to do some of that type of thing, it's going to be a little more difficult to do on DC. But full disclosure, just wanted to get that out. Alrighty, so that was a little bit of a tangent, but important information to know when you're getting started in the DC ecosystem. So the question comes down to, if I was starting again, what would I do? And so this is my recommendation. Vintage guys, if you are coming back into the hobby, you have a bunch of rolling stock, you just want some good track to lay down and a DC controller, you just want to run some trains. Personally, I think the Cato M2 with the siding, you can do some cool things with it. You could do a bit of a yard or have a siding, and it's a good chunk of track, and it has a decent radius. It's going to look decent having your engines run around it. That's probably where I'd start. On sale, you can get it for about $140. Normally 150 to 160. So keep an eye out for that. I think you're really going to be happy with it. Fits really good on the kitchen table and breaks down really easy, and it's super reliable. The guys wanting to do a shelf layout, I would look into used Atlas track. There is kind of a big curve in cost when it comes to buying new track versus used track. Get yourself some good used turnouts, kind of put together a track plan on any Rail 6, and then get some good flex track and just glue it down to a piece of wood and maybe do a little bit of grass work, throw up some buildings. Just as simple as you can do it, and I think you're going to enjoy that quite a bit. Connecting to track can be a little bit harder, just need to do some soldering. Hopefully you are okay with that. Otherwise, the Cato stuff's going to work really good as well. The turnouts are a little more limited, so it's going to change the type of shelf layout for switching, but I think that would be a really good place to start. I have a couple of recommendations. It seems to me that I would probably look into getting one Cato SD40-2. They're small enough that they can do switching work. They're pretty common doing switching work now. They're affordable, easy to convert to DCC should you want to in the future. And they have just a long enough wheelbase that should you have some turnouts that are a little more finicky, there's enough distance between those wheels that you're always on power, and they're super reliable for that. And they have really good slow speed control. They're not the best pullers, but they're very quiet and very smooth running engines. So I think that would be a really good place to start if I was doing a switching layout again. Now, for you guys that just want the easy start, buy everything as something, starter set, don't want to think about it, I made it pretty clear. I personally think in the realm of steam engines, Bachmann makes a decent set. They're usually pretty affordable, and they tend to run pretty good. I've had a few in the past. They're quiet. They run better on wider track, but they do function on the Bachmann track that they come with. Good prices on a lot of those. They're a lot of fun. The passenger train stuff, again, you're probably looking at a Bachmann. Although the ES44AC from Cato, you kind of get the same stuff that I showed you in that kit. It's a wider radius track. Get some straights. The rolling stock kind of is the downfall there. I wish they'd get that fixed, but honestly, really do work good. They're a little harder to find now, but Cato also has F units with some rolling stock, grain car, and some other things. If you can find those, they're usually about $150 used. They're excellent. I would really try to find one of those if you wanted to have a freight type setup. And then all day Cato passenger sets are the way to go. The Silver Streak is awesome. The Burlington, just beautiful to look at. They run really quiet. They are awesome sets. You can get those for about $180, I believe, maybe closer to $220. I've seen them on sale for $180 as the full starter sets. I want to say there's a Milwaukee one that's yellow and green. I can't remember. That one's pretty cool. Not as nice to look at. The Santa Fe starter sets are in stock right now. depending on when you're watching this video. They're about 220. Awesome kit. Run really quiet. Engines are all super smooth in these F units. Even the Bachmann ones run really smooth. But yeah, you can't beat that Super Chief set. It is just iconic and awesome to look at. So, kind of know where I sit there. So, I would personally save that little bit of extra money if you're doing the starter set, and probably go with the Cato passenger units. You're not switching with them more than likely. You're just kind of hooking up and going, which kind of means less headache at the end of the day. And that $220 isn't the end of the world. I think that is probably the best place to start. So thanks for stopping by, everybody. I will see you next week when we actually deep dive into understanding all of the different types of rolling stock and the couplers that come on them. So I'll see you then. Bye now.